What's up, everybody? Welcome to another installment of That Science and Nature Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Howard, and we have a special episode for you today. We're going to be talking all about stories from the field. Joining me this episode, we have Ray Kannenberg.
Hello.
And George Todd.
Hey, everyone.
So, Becky and Sebastian are away doing various things. Sebastian's doing field work. Becky's on a trip. So I have two lovely guests. We're going to talk about all the fun things that have happened out in the field. But before we dive into that, I want to just have them introduce themselves a little bit. So, Ray, why don't you tell the audience who you are?
Hi, my name's Ray. I'm a student here at UMSL, second-year PhD student. I do my research out of the Danforth Center. I work on root-associated fungus and how that influences bacterial communities.
All right, and George Todd, who are you?
I am a third-year PhD student here at UMSL in the biology department, actually in the same lab as Jeremy. And my research is all about hoverflies, which are a very interesting and understudied group of insect pollinators.
Yes, so George and I have had lots of fieldwork experience. Ray has also had a little bit of fieldwork experience, so we're going to share just funny anecdotes that have maybe not always funny. Sometimes they're serious, sometimes they're scary. I don't actually know everyone's stories here. We'll see. But we're going to get into those in a minute. But to start out the show and the conversation, we want to talk about what is the field. So we talk about, as biologists or biology students, the field a lot. We're going out into the field. I got some field work to do today. I'm going to the field till 9 o'clock at night tonight. What is the field? We just rattle off this term a lot. What does that mean? Is there a big grassy meadow we all go out to and hang out at with our plants and animals? What's the field?
Well, I think of the field as just a general term for you're going out into the real world to do research of some kind in the real world, and that is distinguished from, I think, the other major category of research known as lab work. So, and the big difference between the two, I think, is that there are advantages and disadvantages to both. In lab work, it's a lot easier to control for all sorts of variables. So that allows you to answer or try to answer research questions in very specific ways that allow you to have a controlled setting. But the downside to that is that what happens in laboratory and controlled settings is not always representative of what actually happens out in the real world in nature. Is another way to phrase that. So in doing field work, although you can't control as many variables and in the setting, the goal is usually to get a better idea of how things behave, how things act, how things occur in the natural world.
Yeah, well put. Field, basically we're going outside. Now, what your field, quote unquote, might be is going to vary based on what you're studying, what kind of environment you're looking at. So, for example, Sebastian has just left for Ecuador, and he is in a very tropical rainforest field area, whereas my research is here in St. Louis. It's much more urban and, a lot more concrete going on there. So the field can kind of refer to different things, but generally, yes, we're going outside somewhere to study something. It's kind of the gist of it. So yeah, we talked about field. What is the field and field work? Field work is just, going out to do the actual data collection outside for whatever your study is. And now we'll get into some stories. So we're going to go round robin between me, George, and Ray, sharing the stories that we have. We can interject or ask questions or anything like that during the show. But yeah, these ought to be interesting because, again, I haven't heard them from my other co-host right now. So do you want to start, George, or do you want me to start?
I'll let you take it away.
Okay. So my first story, I just gave it an arbitrary title. It's called The Tree Story. So this is from my master's institute. Currently, we're all PhD students here at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. So I attended Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, which is across the river about 30 miles away. And for my master's research, I studied southern flying squirrels. They're this nocturnal squirrel that has this cool membrane that I can use to glide from tree to tree. It's not like the ground squirrels you see just running around your backyard or in the city and stuff. These are specialized squirrels. Nocturnal, like I said, so we studied them at night. My project was basically figuring out where these squirrels go in the forest. We were doing a technique called radio telemetry. The way this works is that think of it like your car radio tuning into a radio station. So the radio tower gives off a certain frequency. You tune into that frequency and can hear the radio coming in. Similar idea with radio telemetry is that you put a collar that gives off a radio frequency on the squirrel, and then you have an antenna and linked to a receiver that basically picks up on that signal, and you can track where that frequency is coming from, and ultimately move yourself towards the squirrel, which is in a tree, and then mark that GPS location. And you do this over and over and over again, and you can figure out all the places the squirrel's going in a forest. So this research that I did was mostly at night, between like 8 p.m. and midnight, because the squirrels were what's called crepuscular, which means they're mostly active at the start of the night and the end of the night. So like between 8 and midnight is the beginning of the night, and then like between like 4 and 6 a.m. is like the end of the night. So like kind of those middle night hours, not as much. But yeah, this involves a lot of tracking between 8 p.m. and midnight. And the tree story is basically this. So one of the professors at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville, let us use this property. It's about, I want to say, maybe 30 acres of forested farmland. Really awesome forest, a lot of space to move around in, a lot of squirrels we captured there. And my assistant and I were out at night. Her name's Marley. It's probably not important for the story, but just so you know, there's another person there with me. Great field assistant, by the way. She and I were out. We found the squirrel, and we would do this thing where if we found the squirrel at the tree, we'd mark the GPS location, and we'd wait for a half hour. And the reason for that is like a statsy reason that's not super important, but basically it wasn't so we were constantly on top of the squirrel, like recording GPS points too fast. We were giving time for the squirrel to move around, basically. So it's about, I want to say, 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. We're in the middle of the woods. It's dark at night. We're resting under this tree that we found the squirrel at. And usually we're just on our phones or like listening to music or whatever, because you have to kill a half hour and like there's nothing else to do in the middle of the woods at night. So we're sitting there and I hear this loud crack. And this is like in the middle of July. You can hear all the insects and stuff like kind of chirping away. And I look around and I'm like, what was that? Like that was loud. So I keep looking around. I'm like, okay, maybe it's like a branch or something, or blowing in the wind. I don't know. And then I hear another crack, and I'm like looking around, a little more scared now. I'm like, that was also very loud. And then the cracks start to continue more and more. And I realize what is happening is that there's a tree falling in the forest. I am in fact around to hear it fall. So I don't know where the tree is coming from. I just hear the loud crack and crack and crack. And it's like somewhere, the sound is ricocheting all over the forest. And I just like, Marley, get down. So we just like hit the floor. And I want to say about like 100 feet away, there's just this loud boom. And the entire like forest just shakes and a bunch of birds and stuff fly away. I don't see them because it's night, but I hear them fly away. And it just gets really quiet for a minute. I was like, oh my God, a tree just fell in the forest like 100 feet away from us.
Wow.
And we were like, are you okay? She's like, yeah, I'm okay. Are you okay? Yeah. I was like, okay. Well, I guess we can just keep doing field work. So, like, because we're both fine, but we're just like crazy scared right now.
Yeah, just keep rolling, I guess.
Yeah. So that was very intense. Yeah, you don't ever want to be around a tree when it's falling. And since it was pitch black and I didn't know where it was coming from, that was even more scary.
I can imagine. Yeah. I mean, so it was, you didn't have any artificial light, really?
We had our headlamps.
Just headlamps? Yeah. Okay. So can you mention briefly what the dynamic is like doing field work at night in particular? Because that is kind of unique. I mean, there's a lot of people that do field work at night, but I imagine that is kind of different, and there's things that you have to be aware of. It's kind of different.
Yeah, fieldwork at night is interesting because obviously there's no light, because it's nighttime. But there's just a lot more things you have to be aware of spatially, because your headlamp can only reveal so many things, and like there's just a lot more branches, and like we ran into a lot of cobwebs and spiders and stuff like moving around the field at night, just because there's just a lot of like things you don't account for, and there are certain animals that are more active and stuff at night, like there be a lot more mosquitoes or insects chirping and stuff. I definitely ran into a lot more branches and stuff. So you have to move a lot more slowly through the forest, because you can't just be like, I can see like 300 feet ahead of me. Like I mentioned with the tree story, it's just like, I didn't know where that tree was coming from. That tree could have been like right next to us, but because of just the like sound and stuff and the limited visibility, you have to be a lot more careful, move a lot more slowly. It also definitely sucked a couple times because the forest obviously is very large, and I had a GPS unit to help us navigate. But I'll be honest, we got lost a couple times.
Oh my gosh!
And we got turned around. I'm like, I got a little smarter later and would like tie ribbons around key trees. I'm like, okay, I know this means we're like roughly this far from the car and stuff, or at different points in the forest. There's a couple times I was like to my field system, like, yeah, we're a little turned around right now. I gotta figure out where we are because I don't actually know.
Wow.
So yeah, it's you need to make sure you know where you're going and where you are, and it's good to tell people that you're going out at night if you're doing field work. Someone knows where you're going and how long you're expected to be out. Because obviously, if something does happen, like we did get lost, because the woods were much bigger than 30 acres. The professor's property was only that much of his property, but the forest was way larger. Like there were other like people's property on that area, so we could have like ventured way deeper into the forest, and like that could have been way worse. But yeah, that's the true story.
Wow, that's good. That would be quite an experience to have that happen so close to you and happen at night where visibility is much more restricted.
Yeah, that was intense.
That's a little scary.
All right, so go ahead, George. Why don't you share a story for us?
I have a couple stories actually that were from around the same time, and I'll start with one of them. So this happened when I was getting my master's degree in biology from 2014 to 2016. I got that degree at a university called Georgia Southern University, which is in Statesboro, Georgia. That is about an hour from the Georgia coastline on the East Coast. So it's quite a ways down in the state of Georgia. And my research there largely involves snakes, actually, which is quite different than the insect pollinators that I currently study here at UMSL. And my advisor and I worked together on various aspects of that part of my thesis work and research, and some of that work involved going out into the field to do what's called a cover board study. And so cover boards are just sheets of material that can be made of metal or wood, and you can lay them out in an array in the woods or in a field. And what happens over time is that the wildlife acclimates to them, and then they will start using those boards as refuge, meaning that they'll kind of slide under them. So it's mostly small wildlife. You'll get snakes and lizards and frogs and occasionally turtles, different mammals like mice and rats and shrews. And then later you can go and flip the cover boards and find what wildlife is underneath them. So it's a really nice survey technique that you can do. So to my specific story, I was with my advisor doing some of this survey work. We had laid out cover boards in this area west of Statesboro. And he and I were out, and we had a specific sequence that we were checking the cover board. So you go to one and you flip it, and you have your notes there, and you make note of what's there and a few other things. Then you put it back, you go to the next one, do the same thing, repeat, and then so on and so forth through all the cover boards. We're traveling between two of the cover boards and just kind of walking, and he was behind me, and we were kind of chatting a little bit, so I was kind of distracted in conversation with him while I was walking. And as I'm walking, I suddenly happen to look down in between steps, so I have one foot that's moving to take the next step, and I look where my foot is about to land, and there is an eastern diamondback rattlesnake coiled up right where my foot is about to land. So did I actually step on the snake or not? No. Thankfully, no. I changed the path of where my foot was going to land, and I stepped right next to the snake, but that threw my walk off kind of wonky, and so I kind of stumbled, and then my advisor was kind of looking to the side, I guess, and so I sort of had stopped walking in that little stumble, and he sort of ran into me, and then I was yelled out, snake, and so we both like got out of the way, and there may have been a couple curse words thrown out there during that whole little couple second ordeal. So we almost stepped on this rattlesnake, but we didn't. But we stayed there, and we got some really nice photographs of it. It was a beautiful snake, all coiled up, and this was actually in winter time, and the winter months in South Georgia are actually quite nice, and the snake was taking advantage of that nice warm. It was kind of a warm winter day, and so that it was enjoying kind of heating up in that. So that was kind of a disaster averted. But overall, I'll make this plug here real quick. So a lot of people don't like snakes. They're not the most popular animal in the world, and especially in the American South, the phrase as it goes is, the only good snake is a dead snake. But really, snakes overall, just like most other wildlife, are not aggressive, out to get you, view you as a prey item to eat. They'll really only attack if they're cornered or they're provoked, and so normally If you see a snake, you don't have to worry about anything. You just don't bother it, and you can just let it be, and it will let you be. And so they're actually really useful ecologically. They eat a lot of animals that we consider to be pests, like rodents and things like that. So, but it was a good story, and disaster averted.
So, how far, I guess, were you from like your car or from civilization? Like, had you been bit, like, would have been like bad? Like, we're really far away right now from a hospital.
No, we were west of Statesboro, but we were actually just outside this slightly smaller town called Metter, Georgia. And so we could have, the vehicle we were in was not that far away, so we could have gone over to the vehicle and driven into town and gotten help there, I think. So this was thankfully not so far out in the boonies that it would have been very problematic.
Also, a quick question in terms of like pop culture. Sucking out the venom, that's not a thing, is it? For snakes?
No.
Okay. So does you know where that comes from? I'm just curious.
It looks cool in movies.
Okay.
There are all sorts of old wives' tales and rumors and things about a lot of animals, but in particular, I think a lot of like reptiles and amphibians. There's all sorts of things that got started sometime in the past that, like, it's kind of like if a toad pees on you, you'll get warts. Kind of
yeah, I
thing.
remember hearing that as a kid.
That's an
Yep,
old
yep.
wives' tale. If that's true, then I would actually have very ugly hands,
Yeah, me too.
which they look pretty normal to me.
Yeah, I used to have warts on my knee when I was a kid that we got burned off by the dermatologist. I remember the dermatologist be like, "Oh, did you like touch a toad or something?" I was like, "What?" Because that was like a big, I guess not stereotype. Like at the time, it was knowledge to be that might be the cause.
Yeah, that goes deep if your dermatologist believes it too.
This was in like I don't know the early 2000s or something. Like it was a long time ago. So, but yeah, I think it was just a passing joke. But all right, I guess now it's my turn. So for another flying squirrel story. Again, I feel like most of these stories don't actually have the flying squirrel in them. It's a bit of a misnomer, but all right. So we're going to transition back. We're back in the woods of Illinois in that Pross farmland. This is in the same area during the same summer. So, like I mentioned in my last story, and we talked about with nighttime field work, it's dark and there's a lot of space to move around in, and I said the professor's land was only about 30 acres, and there were other there were other individuals who owned parts of the forest. So not all of it belonged to one person. So I had to keep this in mind because I can't just like venture onto other people's property without permission. No one really wanted me to do that. But once or twice I had to track a flying squirrel, admittedly, because the squirrels don't stop at the boundary line. So admittedly, I did a sneak over. But this is not entirely about that. This is just about what sort of happened on the way back. So since it's in the forest of Illinois, people have hunting towers and people hunt in the woods and stuff. And one of the neighbors had a camera trap set up that was like close to the boundary line of the property. So a camera trap, if you don't know what this is basically like a camera you set up on a tree to take pictures of mammals. Usually it's like deer or other raccoons or larger animals. People use them for hunting a lot when they want to like check for deer or other things. And then wildlife biology people use them for, raccoons, other squirrels, anything you're trying to look at in a forest. Basically the premise is it's like triggered by a sensor. So if you walk by, it'll snap a photo of whatever walks in front of it. The photos are in black and white, if I believe. I think you can get color ones, but they're more expensive. But anyway, yeah, it snaps the photo, and then there's like a reset period where it waits like X number of seconds until it snaps another photo. That's just in case, something runs in front of it. It doesn't take like 85 photos of the same thing. The thing will pass by and whatever. So I was then coming back from tracking a squirrel. This was probably between 10:30 and 11 at night. And I was exhausted because I've done it for several hours. This is the middle of the summer in Illinois, which is still the Midwest area relative to St. Louis. It's very hot and humid. I just want to get back to my car and get back to the apartment and stuff and just finish off the night and just go to bed. So I was exhausted. It was very sweaty and gross. And I kind of got lost a little bit. I knew like roughly where I was, but I wasn't like terribly lost. But I was like, I need to like head this way just to get out of the forest and get to the clearing because the neighbor had like a pond that I was vaguely aware of that kind of was near the professor's property that had my car parked at it. I was like, all right, it's like 10:30. No one's going to see me. It's fine, whatever. So I kind of like make this shortcut. I come out of the woods. I see the pond. I just walk along the strip of grass along the forest, get back to the car, drive back. But I remember there being like a little flash or like a little like snap hit. Like I felt like I was seen by something. And I didn't know this was a camera trap at this point. this is why I mentioned the camera trap at the beginning. So I go back and I'm like, I felt like I was like weirdly, like someone saw me. Like I wasn't supposed to be there, but I felt like I was very like exposed for a second. I was like, all right, that kind of spooked me again. It was like 10:30 at night. I was like, let's just get the heck out of here. So I drive back and I go to bed and my anxiety starts to like fester a little bit. And I go to bed. This is like a really random thing to interject in the story, but I have this dream about like someone whispering in my ear, being like, we know you weren't where you were supposed to be last night. We know you trespassed. You're on. Like, and I just wake up and like, and the next morning it's like 6:30, and I'm like, oh, like okay, like why do I feel so bad about this? I was like just trying to get back to my car. I wasn't trying to like trope through someone's property. And I check my phone. It's like I don't know between 6:30 and 7 in the morning. I have a text, and it's from the professor. And it says, was this you last night? And it's the photo of me caught by the camera trap with like, it's like at 10:37 at night or whatever, like with the antenna and stuff. So I know it's me. And I was like, oh my God, like they know I was on their property. It's like caught red-handed. And I was just like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like I was texting the professor, like, I'm so sorry. It was late at night. I was trying to get back to the car. I got a little lost, et cetera, et cetera. I was like, okay, yeah, it's fine. The neighbors just got super scared because I sent the way their camera trap worked is it sends the photos from the trap to their phone. It was like a little more high tech, so they could like kind of track deer and other stuff that was on their property. Mm-hmm. So they saw that, and then like the wife and husband were like totally alarmed. They apparently all their entire neighborhood is like in a text chain, so they're like texting about me, being like, "Who is this man? Why is he on our property? What's going on with that?" And then the professor, when I was texting him apologizing, he was like, oh, yeah, sorry, like we only told some of the neighbors, but not all of the neighbors that you were working on this project on our property. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess they know now. So the neighbors were fine about it, but there was a little bit of like, oh, they were worried they might need to call the police or something and have like a police search in the woods for, trespassers and stuff. So that really spooked me a little bit. So I guess there's a moral of the story, but I would say if you're a community member and you have someone on your property, make sure you notify your neighbors that they will be there and what times they will be there and what they're carrying, what kind of activity they're doing for their research. Because that's very important, because that could have been a bad situation where like the cops could have been called on me and I could have been like arrested in the woods and like dragged out of a police car. Yeah. So
especially when you have a text thread that goes to everybody
in
one message.
Yeah, I don't know the dynamics of the text thread, but it was just weird. I was like, why did you only tell some of your neighbors but not all of them? It's just like a glaring omission that I didn't understand. But I was like, I didn't get in trouble or anything. I was just very like scared. So
yeah, that's good that it didn't develop further.
It didn't develop for the camera.
I guess to put it that way. But that is a good point that you bring up, and that's actually something very important to fieldwork in general. Is fieldwork will often take place on either private property or property that is managed or someone has authority or is in charge of, and so getting proper permission and staying in good communication with those people is very important. And another thing in fieldwork is not only that, but also just understanding that sometimes those kinds of dynamics will change through time, especially with field sites that you're hoping to use for more than one season. So maybe like through multiple years, someone may be comfortable or allow you to use a given property 1 year, but then things may change down the line, and so that can cause hiccups and things. But of course, it's within those people's rights to do so, and it's just kind of something that you have to roll with and just be cooperative and work with people on that. So just something to know about a lot of field work.
Yeah. Communication and transparency are very important in the community, and this will I'll talk a little about this with my next story when you come back around to me, but yeah. Definitely important to notify people what you're doing and make sure, you don't want to just spook anybody with what you're doing. So, all right, George, now it's your turn again.
All right, so I've got that second story from that same time period, 2014 to 2016, and the story actually takes place on Spring Island, Georgia, which is an island along the Georgia coast that is very sparsely habited. So this is not like, for example, Tybee Island, which is close to Savannah, Georgia, or actually, excuse me, I misspoke. This is Spring Island, South Carolina. This is just over the border and not super populated, like, for example, Hilton Head Island, which is on the South Carolina coast. But my advisor had a collaborator on that island by the name of Tony Mills, and he worked for a group called the Low Country Institute, which was largely educational and outreach based, and so they had a facility there, and people could come and see various kinds of animals and get little tours on the land that they kind of like managed. But he would also go out into the community, and there's a lot of older individuals that lived of the people that did live on that island. He would go and do outreach events and give speeches and demonstrations and things, and would bring wildlife. And he collaborated with my advisor actually through cover boards, which I had mentioned in my previous story. And he had a series of cover boards that were laid out on various areas of that island. And he requested the assistance of my advisor, whose name is Zach, if I'd forgot to mention that before. He requested Zach and I's assistance on flipping a bunch of the cover boards during one weekend. So Zach and I drove from Statesboro, Georgia over to Spring Island, and we met up with him, and we were going around and flipping these cover boards to see what kinds of things are under them. And so this is not winter anymore, this is summer. And summer along the South Carolina coast, just as it is in South Georgia, is quite hot and humid. And so we're sweating, it's out in broad daylight, and we're trying to get into shade, take little breaks here and there, stay hydrated, all of that good stuff. And we very early on, this story happened very early on in the process of going around to these boards and flipping them. I learned that the approach that Tony Mills took to the wildlife under the cover boards was a little different than Zach and Mai's approach. Okay. In that sometimes you can actually grab wildlife that you find under the cover boards if it doesn't kind of hide in the ground or run away before you can do that. And you can do that so that you can collect different kinds of data. For example, you can get the sex of the animal, or you can measure the body length, just kind of basic things like that. Sometimes you can even inject an animal with a little tiny tracking bit. And so there's different things that you can do. But Tony was interested in grabbing lizards and snakes just so we could get some basic kinds of measurements like that. And so normally, Zach and I's approach is if you find a snake that you just we have these snake hooks. So snake hooks are used to handle snakes and maneuver them around, but they're also very useful tools just for flipping boards because you can get the little hook part underneath the board and flip it without having to actually use your hand to flip it, which it would be a good idea to have a glove if you do it that way, but you don't have to bend down if you have the hook, so it's just easier. So you have the snake hook, and then to grab a snake, you take the hook and you just kind of pin the neck of the snake down with one arm so that it's kind of immobilized, and then you go in with your other hand and then you grab it by the neck with your other hand. So then as long as you have the snake by the neck, it can't bite you basically, and so then you can handle it just fine. Tony Mills had a different approach. So we flip a board, and another thing to note about this story is that in the summertime, in the very, very hot months, generally when snakes, or really kind of all reptiles and amphibians in general, the hotter it is outside, the hotter their body temperature, just because their body temperature just tends to be more or less what the environment is, which is different from us. So when it's very hot out, their body temperature is likely to be hotter, and when it's very cold out, the opposite. When it's very cold out and you encounter a snake, it's oftentimes possible just to literally go and pick up the snake without it moving, just because its body temperature is so cold, it's very sluggish and doesn't really want to move around. When it's very hot out, the opposite is true. So what is the opposite of staying still? Moving around like crazy.
Yep.
So these animals under these cover boards were actually quite hot. And so Tony Mills flips over the board, and we see this black racer, which is this very, very fine-looking species of snake in that region. It is a little bit more aggressive than some of the other snakes you can find in that region, though. And it's also very, very hot. So you flip the board and you expose it, and it's got a hot body temperature. It's ready to move. And so it's starting to slither and go away. Instead of using the hook to try to pin the snake down, Tony Mills just reaches down and grabs the snake with his hand. Wow. And what happens after you just grab a snake? You're probably going to get bitten. And as a matter of fact, that was actually his strategy. So he just simply reaches down, grabs the snake turns around and bites him on the wrist, and he gives a little bit of a yell. But then once it's biting his wrist, he just uses his other hand, takes it by the neck, and just removes it, and then bam, he has the snake.
Wow. That's
So
bold.
I mean, I was thinking like, okay, is this guy is this like Bear Grylls or something? Like, I mean, I guess you just don't mind getting bit, and obviously you can't do this with venomous snakes. It is possible to handle venomous snakes. I would urge the average listener not to do that. You do have to be trained to do that properly.
You can do it one time with venomous snakes.
Yeah, one time, and then there's consequences. Yeah. So he would not do this with venomous snakes, of course, and black racer snakes are non-venomous. But that's just a really direct approach, and he would just grab it, let the snake bite him, and then he just told us, yeah, it's just easier to then grab it by the neck if it's already biting you and it's right there. And I'm thinking, that's good for you. I don't know if I'll adopt that strategy, but I am impressed. I gain a lot of respect for him there.
Okay. This Tony Mills sounds like an interesting man I need to meet at some point.
Yeah, he is a naturalist through and through. So he knew a lot of things about all kinds of animals, including insects and other arthropods and things like millipedes. Knew a good amount about the different plant species. So he was a naturalist, I would say,
Okay.
through and through.
Cool. I have another snake question since snakes are not my expertise. With the snake boards, when you lift them up, is it kind of just like a 1, 2, 3, whoop, and you just quickly do it, or is it like a gradual, like you lift it up and peek under?
Generally, I think it's better to do it quickly because if you gradually do it, the animal might react and try to hide in the dirt or in the ground or escape. And if you do it slowly, if the animal starts to do that and you've only flipped the cover board just a little bit, your visibility is kind of constrained, and so it's harder to see what the animal is doing. So, as opposed to if you just flip it fast, bam, you can clearly see everything there, and then make a decision if the animal reacts immediately. So I would say that's generally better. But then you generally always also want to put the cover board back in its same position. So as long as you can remember, if you just flip it and it flies like 4 feet away, as long as you can put it back kind of in the exact same spot, you're good.
So how long are these cover boards out? Like I know you go and drop them and come back, but like how long is that?
They can be laid out indefinitely,
Okay.
which is nice. It's different from certain other strategies like pitfall traps. So you can create pitfall traps which funnel animals that kind of run into this barrier into this little container or trap, and then they fall in and then they can't get out. That tends to you tend to find more things that way, but the downside is that you have to check them regularly because anything that falls in the trap is going to die. With cover boards, things are free to come and go as they please. So you can leave them out as long as you want and not worry about anything dying. Now, for the purposes of my study, going back to the cover boards I mentioned in my first story earlier, I had those out for a year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and I had permission on the land that I laid them out. I had 3 sites. One of them was on a professor in the department's father. That was from the story I mentioned earlier. And then 2 other sites were actually Georgia Southern University property. So I had permission from all those places to have them out that long.
Cool. Okay. Very cool. All right. So now it is my turn. This is my last story. So I just called this the sidewalk story because it was on a sidewalk. I'm very great with these names.
Very creative.
But it really has nothing to do with the sidewalk. Actually, most of these stories are... No, actually, the other 2 were the tree story and the camp track story actually had to do with it. The sidewalk story is just where we're sitting. Okay, so George did a good job mentioning the timeline of when those things were. I did not. Just for context, those Southern Flying Squirrel stories were from 2018 in my master's. I was there from like 2017 to 2019. Started in the PhD program here at UMSL in 2020, and now it's 2023, and I'm doing some research. I'm studying bumblebees now and not flying squirrels, so organismal shift. Now I'm looking at insects and not mammals. But I'm still looking at movement stuff. So this time for my big field project for my research here at UMSL, what I'm doing is a genetic marker recapture study. Basically what that is it's a marker recapture study where you can do this with any animal. You go out to an area, you look for it, you catch it, take data on it, and you put some kind of tag or marking on it, be like, I caught this animal, and then you let it go. And you come back there at later times and try to catch that animal again, or you might not catch the animal, you might catch new ones. But the idea is you can kind of get population data on like what animals are where and how much of them are there. And if you get recaptures, you can see like, oh, did this animal move between this one area and this other area I looked at? I'm doing that with a genetic component, so I'm also taking a little piece of DNA from all of the bees. Basically, I'm like clipping like a millimeter or two of leg, which sounds very violent, but the insects have 6 legs. Bumblebees have front, back, and middle legs. If you take a small piece of the middle leg, it doesn't impact them overall. So they can still forage for their pollen and nectar, still support their colony, doesn't kill them. But the reason I mention this is because there's some tools that are related to the story. Because we use like a small piece of like medical scissors. They're called like Varnis scissors, I think, if I remember correctly, and then like tweezers to like do this while the bee is basically anesthetized. Anesthetized being knocking it out, and we do this by just throwing it in like a little cooler. It like for like 10-15 minutes, the bee just kind of goes under, falls on its back. We clip the leg, and then the bee wakes up because the cold kind of wears off. That's all important for context because we're carrying a lot of equipment with us. So for this study here at UMSL, I'm doing this now not in the rural forests of Illinois, but instead across the St. Louis region. So what I'm mostly doing for my bee research is looking at comparing very urban downtown areas where I'm catching bees, and then also more suburban areas, and then also comparing it to natural areas. So I have urban downtown sites, suburban areas in a couple parts of St. Louis, and then a natural site kind of out on the outskirts of St. Louis. So comparing urban, suburban, and natural. So like I mentioned earlier with the Southern Flying Squirrel story with, notifying your neighbors and other people about what you're doing, there's been a lot of community outreach with this project. So I've been talking to a lot of community members, schools, parks, et cetera. So a lot of people know I'm doing this project. However, unlike, the middle of the woods, or if you're out in a more natural area, when you're in downtown St. Louis, like I am for a lot of this project, there's just a lot of people around, and people can kind of walk by and ask. And I'm always happy to talk with community members about what I'm doing. But sometimes people don't always understand what I'm doing, or they might make assumptions about what it looks like I'm doing, and ask or project or say things that may or may not be correct. So this is kind of one of those scenarios. So one of the areas of St. Louis is this neighborhood called Soulard. Soulard is kind of in, I'd say, like the southeast portion of the city, roughly geographically. It's close to the river, the Mississippi River, that is. I would say it's kind of the artsy district a little bit. It's got like the market and stuff. That's kind of the vibe I get from it. A little more affluent. But there's a handful of community gardens and volunteer members that have offered their yards for me to sample for bumblebees at. And one of the areas that was recommended is basically this sort of community restoration garden that's at the corner of these 2 streets. It's right next to the Anheuser-Busch campus, which is like the big beer-making company campus area. And it's this really cool garden on the corner of the street, but it's also on the corner of a street. So like there's traffic and stuff, which is kind of an awkward thing to do when you're like looking for bees and like, I got to watch out for these cars coming by.
Yeah.
So yeah, this was actually happened like about a month ago. I was with my field assistant, Emma, another great field assistant, Marley, great field assistant, Emma, great field assistant. The stories always happen when I have my good field assistants with me. If I have bad ones, like nothing ever happens. So we're out there, we're sampling this like corner garden area between these 2 streets in downtown Soulard. And we caught a couple of bees, we've dodged all the cars and stuff. We're back on the sidewalk, as the story would suggest. We're processing the bees. And all the equipment I mentioned earlier, the cooler with the ice, the tools for cutting off the bee's legs, or cutting off a section of the bee's leg, that's all like splayed out in the ground. Because what happens is we catch all the bees, we sample for about an hour, and then, we'll move on to another site. But we got to like take data on all the bees we have. So like what bees did we catch? What location did we catch them in? What's the species? We got to take the sample and put a tag on it and all that stuff. All the equipment's splayed out. So like I have like the cooler over here. We have like a little Tupperware container that we like open up and like kind of process the bee on. It has like the scissors and stuff, and there's like glue and stuff for the tags, and there's like my notebook. And so everything's just kind of splayed out on the sidewalk. And I guess because of all the tools and stuff, people thought that my field assistant and I, because we're in, I guess, the downtown urban area, that we were doing some kind of drugs. So St. Louis does have a drug problem, but this, I guess people just thought we were just kind of hitting it up on the sidewalk. So what happened was, like, we're processing a couple of bees, we're doing our thing, and people are kind of walking by and, like, giving us, like, weird looks and stuff. And then someone drives by, like, perpendicularly to the street we're on, and they just shout out, "They're shooting up heroin!" And then they, like, drive by, and we're just, like, looking around, like, what was that? Like, that was really weird, like... Okay, like, all right, well, they drove by, so we can't do anything. Like, we're not going to go talk to them. And then we just like, all right, well, back to business. And I want to say, like, 5 to 10 minutes later, then someone else on their bike rides by, and I guess they also thought we were doing drugs. So they're like, these mother effing junkies on our street corner. He just rides by with his bike and like just rides off into the distance. And my field assistant just looks at me and she's just like, did he just call us junkies? And I was like, yes, he did. We're gonna keep working now. I'm sorry, like I can't do anything about this. And I was like half expecting like a cop to show up or like a third person to kind of like conclude this little arc right here, but it didn't happen. But it was like several people thought we were doing some kind of illegal drugs on the street corner. Because I guess maybe people in St. Louis do that, like if they're homeless or they're like they have drug problems. I have no idea. But like the way people like just shouted at us made it seem like this is something that they would see regularly. So I was just like, okay, be a little more aware of this, I guess.
Wow, I'm glad that didn't escalate further. And
I was actually a little worried that it might, because like they were like aggressively yelled at us. Like they didn't just like, haha, like you're doing drugs. It was just like, it was like get this filth out of my city kind of yell. Like, so.
People's opinion of science is really degraded, yeah.
Yeah, it was also funny. This is like an epilogue to this. Like this week, when my field system were in the park in like a different area of Old North, which is like the historic district of St. Louis. It's more in the northeast part of the city, towards southeast. I was walking around the park, and someone literally came up to me and be like, "Hey, do you have any rolls?" And they like did like the smoking a blunt like pantomime,
Yes,
and I was
sir.
just like. No, and they just turned around and walked away. I was like, "What about the bug net and the cooler and the stuff? Like, do we look like we're doing drug stuff here?" Like, so
yeah,
just like,
it's almost like you need a little sign thing to stick next to.
I
it
am not a
to
drug
you
dealer.
doing, or just be research, or I don't know. Maybe people would still think that you're doing drugs.
So as much as it is good to communicate your science with the neighbors and community members who ask, I'm always happy to talk about it. Like I mentioned, I've talked to a lot of amazing people in Old North and Soulard and different parts of the city. Some people just will make assumptions about what you're doing and they won't ask. So be prepared sometimes when you're in city environments.
Yeah, and this, like I had said earlier, I'm glad it didn't escalate, but that's something to realize about just safety overall when you're doing field work is there may be times, there's always the possibility of encountering somebody that might be dangerous or makes you uncomfortable, and it is, I mean, safety is of utmost importance, and so if you ever do find yourself in a situation where you're like becoming seriously worried because of X, Y, or Z, I mean, just leave the area, and I mean, you can, doesn't mean you have to just never work there again or never go there again, but there are stories of people that just kind of like stick around and like, well, I'm staying here and we get to keep doing this, and then they get themselves in situations where bad things happen. So.
As scientists, we can sometimes be very stubborn about wanting to collect data, regardless of how how much it inconveniences us. But it's important to remember your safety is very important above all. Like, it's not worth it to kill yourself for some data. Even if it's like, going out into the woods and it's like a thunderstorm or something when it's dangerous and like traversing or, staying in an environment where there's hostile individuals, like it's never worth it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And that goes with pushing your physical state too. If you're in an area where you really need to be staying hydrated and you're kind of like running low on water, or you've run out of water and you're like, well, I've just got a little bit more to go, or I'm way out here and I've just got a little bit more to go, but I'm kind of feeling a little funny because of whatever. I mean, it's not worth to take those kinds of risks.
Yeah, admittedly, I've definitely pushed myself sometimes. I'm like, we just got one more field site to go. Like, we're fine. We're mostly out of water, but like we're almost done. So that's not the smartest thing to do. It's not a smart thing to do at all. But sometimes I will admit I have done that. All right. So now, George, for your last story.
My last story is in a very different context than the first two. After I graduated and got my master's in biology at Georgia Southern University, I took a teaching job. And I originally did not want to go into teaching, but I was a teaching assistant through my time during my master's, and I found that there were certain aspects of teaching that I actually liked or found fulfilling. And so I decided to start pursuing those kinds of jobs post-graduation. And in fact, I found one and applied and was accepted and got that job. And it was as a biology instructor for Coastal Pines Technical College, which is in Waycross, Georgia, and that's approximately 2 hours from Statesboro, Georgia. So it's actually relatively near where I got my master's. And that school is part of the technical college system of Georgia, of which I think there's 21 schools total. But the large emphasis in a lot of technical colleges is, of course, in industry programs or in allied health programs like nursing, things like that. But there is also pretty commonly general education departments or kinds of courses, and they were looking for a biology instructor, but specifically to teach dual enrollment high school students in the adjacent county at a high school called Pierce County High School. And so in that job, I would actually drive every day actually into the high school and teach high school students that were taking my course for both high school and college credit in a dual fashion, hence the name dual enrollment. And then I would leave and go back. So I taught general biology to those high school students, and then in the summers I would typically teach microbiology to traditional students on the actual college campus in Waycross. So this story takes place at Pierce County High School, and I worked there 5 years. This was 2016 to 2021, and it was in one of the years kind of in the middle of that, I forget. But every spring I would actually take my students out to the woods. There was this woodsy area that was just kind of behind the high school. I would take them out there and ironically have them lay out cover boards out in the woods there. So I guess I really enjoyed my work with cover boards,
yep.
And I was inspired actually, it'd be a neat experience for my students to do that and to be able to actually find wildlife and encounter them, and then they could collect basic things of data if they're able to grab them and that kind of thing. And when I started doing that, I didn't really know how much success we'd find. I mean, it wasn't like a massive forest or anything, and it was somewhat disturbed because of different construction things going on kind of on the other side of it. So I didn't know how many things we'd find, but we would find like snakes and lizards, and we found a box turtle one time, and all sorts of different like insects and arthropods and things like that. So overall, I think it was definitely a nice project for them to do. And one time when we were doing that, we happened to go out, and there's this very, very small pond that's in that woods. And I mean small, like if it doesn't rain for quite a while, it just completely dries up. So it's not that big. But when we had gone out this year, it was kind of it was in its full size. It had plenty of water in it. And this was my earliest class of the day, so 8, 9 a.m., that kind of thing. And we go out there, and we're checking the cover boards and all of that. And then we hear all this noise kind of by the pond as we're starting to get close to it. I'm like, oh, wow, there's something going on. We're getting a little closer and getting a little closer. And then right before we can like see it, I have my suspicions of what I think it is, and it is in fact a toad spawning event.
Oh.
So the sounds were all of these toad calls during the spawning event, which I'll imitate it briefly here. Something like that. Just a giant cacophony of it with a bunch of mating pairs. And so what a spawning event is, I guess I'll tell you what that is real quickly. So these toads, they use external fertilization to reproduce, which means that the male and female toads, they have to release their gametes, namely egg and sperm cells, into the environment, and then those egg and sperm cells will meet and fertilize and then eventually become new toads. And so when they spawn, that just simply means that they will all gather together in an area, usually close to or in water, so that those gametes, the egg and sperm, will stay moist for that process, and then they will actually mount one another. But that's just to try to get the egg and sperm as close together as possible, and then they're calling out so that the whole time, so that they could make sure that they're finding a male or female to be able to continue doing that for whatever duration. So me and all my students that were out there, I mean, there's got to be like 20 of us. I'm leading the group of them out. We stumble upon this, and for any wildlife that they would find under the cover boards, I encourage them with my supervision to try and grab them, or I would assist in that, and actually put them in containers to bring back into the school to then be able to collect like body length measurements and other stuff. And so we stumble upon this, and they're all right there, all doing this spawning event. And one of my students asks me or says "Oh, we hit the jackpot, Mr. Todd! Oh, you got to tell me we can grab some of these up, right?" And I was thinking
Oh boy.
I mean, why not? It'd be it's an easy grab. We can just grab several mating pairs. Why not? And the thing is, if you go up and try to grab a toad, it's probably going to try to get away from you. But
Right.
during the spawning event, they're all caught up in this thing, so it's actually really easy to just go up and grab a pair that are together, and then you can put them in a container and get a little water in there, and then bring them back in, and you'll be good to go. So they, of course, they all want to do this, and I'm like, okay, we're not bringing 20 pairs. I'm not bringing 40 toads into the building. So I let, several of them bring several pairs or more, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. And so they get those, and we finish the coverboard stuff, and then we head back into the building. And this whole time, the toads keep doing their thing, and I'm not really thinking about what this is going to mean when we actually get back into high school. When we get back into the high school, we go into, I had a teaching lecture class kind of classroom, and then a lab room right next to it. I kind of got to use both those rooms. So any animals that we would ever catch, we'd just kind of put in the lab room, and then we'd do data collection and stuff in there. So they bring all the toads and put them in there, and then we're starting to do our thing. But then the toads just keep making all this noise, and it's quite loud in a relatively confined space compared to the very open woodsy space they had outside. They're just continuing to make all this cacophony of noise, and then eventually I look over and I see 3 other teachers that have wandered down from the hallway, and they're looking in here and they're like, "What is going on?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Is this interrupting your classes?" And they're like, "Oh no, not at all. It's really quiet. Just keep them in here," and just being sarcastic. And I was like, "Yeah, maybe this wasn't a great idea," because they were quite loud. So they were making a bunch of noise, and so I had the students hurry up and finish what we were doing, and then I just had them take the toads back out. But then the story spread like wildfire throughout the entire high school, and so suddenly all the teachers and staff and all the students knew that I had brought a bunch of toads in, and so whenever I'd see people in the hallways, probably next week or two, I just get some joke or kind of snarky comment about the toads, and so that kind of stuck with everyone for a little bit, and then just died down. But it was quite an entertaining grab.
Yeah, that's actually really cool that you got to see all that for a teaching, a lesson you got to make out of that.
Yeah, not planned, of course, at all.
But
that
you
was
don't tell them
that was the
You don't
only
tell
that was the
them
only
that.
year that happened. That was the only time we stumbled upon that. We would find toads occasionally just in the woods, but that was the only spawning event that we encountered. So it was very cool.
Very cool. What course did you teach when you were at the college?
So for those students, it was just general biology.
Okay.
So this coverboard project I would have them do would coincide every spring. So the course was divided by the fall and spring semester, but most students would opt to take both. And in the spring semester course, we would get to the ecology unit, and so I would shove this project in during that unit. And most students would like to go outside. A lot of people are country folk and into hunting and fishing and all that stuff. So that's very, very much they're in their element when they're out in the woods doing stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, very cool. Thank you for sharing that story. And Ray, you've been quiet because we've kind of been bouncing back and forth between George and I, but you have a story, to share as well. You want to tee that up?
Yeah, so mainly I'm what you'd call a bench scientist. So my field is my chair and desk and do a lot of molecular work. But I had something like a field experience when I was doing my undergraduate here at UMSL, and was doing these 11-hour time trials with bacteria where I'd have to check them every 2 hours. So I'd spend 20 minutes doing my dilutions and checking things, and then I'd go walk around campus and do things for another hour and a half. And over the course of 2 days, I watched what you would call a eutrophy event, where eutrophy is if you get what happens in rivers a lot. You see it in the Mississippi Delta, where all these nitrogen-rich fertilizers get into the water, and then everything, all the algae grows up. It just totally screws up the ecosystem. And I had a little diorama of this in our 15 by 30 meter pond out here at Umsel, where over the course of a few days I would come out, and then they just put a bunch of new sod around and fertilized it. So the water would get bluer and bluer, and then all of a sudden it had this huge algae bloom, and I'd come out a couple hours later, and then there'd be like a fish floating. And I'd come out a few hours later, and then there were about 60 fish floating, and come out a few hours after that, and there was, in this small pond is like a 40-pound carp that had floated up. So just
wow.
watch this fertilizer completely like feed a bunch of toxic algae and then create this like eutrophic event.
When you say floater, you mean they're dead?
They're gone.
Okay.
Yeah. It killed everything in the pond pretty much, which was poor foresight. And I think when they got rid of the prairies and put the grass in, that was a point of contention with some of the students here too. So
yeah,
watching
the students have been going back and forth. Not to turn this into politics, but the
No,
students have been
exactly.
going back and forth about. We have a pond right outside the science complex called. Well, actually, it's called Bug Lake.
Bug
technically,
Lake.
it's not actually it's not a lake technically. It is a pond, but it's called Bug Lake. Anyway, there's been like kind of a back and forth between the students and the administration about having native plants there versus having mowed grass, because obviously mowed grass looks very nice for
Yeah.
the tours and stuff, but the native plants are much more supportive of the pond ecosystem. So
Well, the pond has since recovered, but it was just kind of funny because that's pretty much what I work on, is like trying to find beneficial microbes to use for growing crops instead of dumping nitrogen fertilizer into environments and things like that. So I got this like tiny contained.
So for our listeners, what exactly is so bad when you get these algal blooms in terms of, so it kills all these fish, and what about that causes so much death?
So I think part of it, it's really good for the algae, like not good for the rest of the things, but it causes this huge overgrowth of algae. So they'll give a lot of cover. I think they'll probably spit some things into the water in high concentrations that aren't quite good for everything. And I think the fertilizers themselves are not very good for the fish and things too. So
Okay.
it chokes them out. And
So
just
there's multiple factors at
Yeah,
work that
yeah.
are very detrimental. Yeah.
when you get on larger scales and you get out in the ocean and things like that, like you can see it on maps, like these huge algae blooms that like dim the light for everything below, eat up oxygen, other things. And I mean, algae produces oxygen, but I think it goes up and they pull things out of the water
Okay.
that are useful
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
yeah, many months ago on the show, we had a story with this sargassum belt, which is basically like a big bloom that it all just kind of washes on the shore, and it's like just so much of it that like they have to like bring in like construction equipment to like haul all of the
Yup.
stuff out of the beach.
Oh wow, yeah. I recall seeing a video a while ago about, this was actually a professor from Ohio State, and he would research the Great Lakes, and there was a particularly bad algal bloom event on one of those lakes. I forget which one, but I remember him saying that there were areas where it was so thick that it would actually slow boat motors when they would when
yeah.
they would
Oh,
go
yeah.
through it, and that's baffling to think. That's a lot of algae.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
And if
Much
you
more
think, like as ecology people, like if you just like totally like feed into one species and it completely takes over, like it's never good for everything else. So yeah, it was an interesting extra.
That is very interesting. Yeah, I've occasionally will take walks around Bug Lake. It is quite small, so it's easy to walk around the
Yeah.
whole thing in just a couple minutes. But it's relatively scenic, and if I'm getting kind of cooped up with doing a lot of work at the computer and I need to step outside, it's kind of a nice area to just kind of like walk around. So I've done that occasionally.
Yeah, like I said, it's fine now. People fish in it, so there's something in there.
Are you allowed to fish in it? I just know you can't ice skate or swim in
I
it.
don't know if you're allowed to. I fished in it too.
Okay.
No one stopped me, so.
We'll find out in
Yeah,
future weeks.
nobody. If anybody knows whether you're allowed to do that or not, nobody telling us.
Yeah. I mean, I've never fished in it. Whichever one is fine.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess for now we'll say fishing is allowed in Bug Lake.
Yeah. Just take our word for it.
All right. Well, that is going to wrap up our show for this episode. Thank you so much for listening this time. I'd like to thank my special guests, Ray Kannenberg and George Todd, for joining me and sharing those really fun stories. This has been a great episode. So thank you both.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a lot of fun.
We will be back on Umsel Radio in about, I want to say, a month. This episode will go up probably in the next couple of weeks before the school year starts, but we'll be back live, and I'll have more information about that on our Facebook page, so stay tuned for that. But until then, you've been listening to That Science and Nature Show. I'm your host, Jeremy Howard, and we're out.